Welcome to Talking Memories, the podcast of the School on European Memories. This season, we explore historical revisionism and ask a bold question. Who owns the past? Join us as we listen, question, and rethink the stories we thought we knew. Let's get into it. Episode 3. Towards a common and unified European memory.
So, hello, we are Hubert, Artsiom, Eliza, Sara, and Mireia, and we are here pleased to welcome Xosé Núñez Seixas. So, to begin with our questions, we first wanted to tell you about how within our group we have been talking about how the project of European integration emerged in the aftermath of the devastation of the Second World War, and how early steps toward what would become the European Union were grounded in anti-Nazism and post-Holocaust. So, however, the European Union has not remained static. We have seen that with major enlargement waves in 2004 and 2007, it incorporated many Eastern European countries whose historical experiences differ from those just mentioned. And so we can see that these diverse historical trajectories have introduced new memories into the European framework and complicating the idea of a single unified narrative. So as the European Union continues to expand and diversify, we also have talked about that this raises an important question, which will be that for you to answer: can there be a common unified European memory?
I don't really think there's going to be ever a common unified European memory. There are so many different national memories. We just talk about it. However, I really think that the European Union and the states that shape the European Union can try to establish some common points of, let's say, of agreement, some common landmarks in the direction of building strong values, and which can serve as a fundamental, can serve as a basis for the construction of an emotional feeling of being Europeans. Whether there is a European memory or not, whether a European memory can be built or not, I think we can simply, we can rather refer to relatively weak points in common. But I would put stronger emphasis on values. And particularly these values could be the defense of democracy, the welfare state, a path of development which also takes into account, could be, say, an economy of free market with a social sensitivity, and then the rejection of totalitarianism or the rejection of authoritarianism, whatever it comes from. And you are right, certainly anti-fascist, a kind of anti-fascist consensus was a common element, a common underpinning element for most Western European democracies after 1945, although this anti-fascist consensus was also built on some historical silences, collaborationism, etc., complicity of occupied countries with the Holocaust, etc. However, certainly the enlargement towards the East has incorporated a new sensitivity, what to do with the Soviet past and with the years of communist rule. And I think a common label is obviously the defense of democracy, the defense of human rights, the defense of the welfare state, and also, let's say, radical defense of a civilized way of life and of the Enlightenment. Of the Enlightenment's values, particularly, our preference for rational, argued discussion, healthy public conversations, and not what we are seeing in other countries, particularly in the United States right now, but also in Russia, a liberal or illiberal democracies where lies are simply triumphant and where lies are, in a way, dominating the public conversation. And then how to achieve this, well, that's another matter. However, I would put a stronger emphasis on values rather than on memory.
Now, if I were to play the devil's advocate, I would say that, values have historically been embedded inside of, usually national myths. It was been the stories of, the triumphs and losses, and they definitely have been black and white stories. They have been incomplete, they have silenced something, and emphasized some other things, but they've been the stories that will tell you well, how to relate to the world, what to think, what to believe. And to kind of push maybe a little bit back on to what you said, aren't we trying to jump the gun, so to say, by saying, well, we need to defend the values, but at the same time acknowledging, well, we don't actually have the shared stories that would carry the values?
But that's true. I mean, we don't have shared stories. You can always go back as far back as you know, as you want. I mean, we can always go as far back as we want. We may also believe that perhaps in the Napoleonic times there was a kind of common project for Europe. I mean, some authors sustain the view that Napoleon has a project for Europe, apart from consolidating his personal power and the power of his family. And there was a construction of a European worldview. Well, perhaps. I mean, some others refer to Charlemagne in the 10th century. But actually, all these projects of building a European worldview were not based on democratic values, or were not always based on democratic values. They also were, in a way, characterized by Eurocentrism, by obviously a strong disregard of all the societies outside Europe, and certainly, and also by the uncertainty. I mean, where does Europe begin and where does Europe end? And in this sense, well, you are right. Memories, and particularly Europe, is composed of many multiple and national memories, which can be traced back to the 15th century, can be traced back to the Middle Ages, and which had been then promoted and imposed from above, constructed by states, by nation states, or by national movements, whatever. Yet it would be time, perhaps the time has come to overcome all these differences and try to find some common elements.
And you are a professor of history.
Yes.
So the next kind of obvious question to you would be, well, do you see any historical precedents of where memory was used in a democratic way, where, in other words, where memory was used to bolster democratic institutions, to strengthen democracy? Is there examples from which we can learn, or from which the EU can learn?
Of course, you can go to the antiquity, particularly to Athens. I mean, democracy. Some Greek authors and Greek historians were also writing to defend the values of democracy in Athens. I mean, you can also refer to the French Convention after the French Revolution or during the French Revolution, where also some measures were implemented in order to foster the knowledge of national history and to promote some values. The problem is that it didn't last so long, and that sometimes it was imposed. I mean, it's not that, and people were even forced to accept this kind of ceremonies or this kind of values. I mean, there are some precedents, of course. I mean, you have the workers' movement in many countries during the 19th century also tried to promote some sites of memory. Even the adoption of a transnational site of memory or a transnational date, our commemoration day like the 1st of May, could also be seen as an example of how memory is used to bolster, to promote democratic values. But obviously, you have to also to take into account that we're talking about democracy when we're talking about human rights in the past. It doesn't exactly correspond, it doesn't exactly overlap with our present-day concept of human rights. I mean, the French Revolution talked about the rights of the citizens. Yeah, but these citizens were particularly male and white and were Europeans. So we have to enlarge our own definitions. Let's say recognition of equal rights of citizenship, access to the benefits of the welfare state for, let's say, gay, lesbians, homosexuals, transsexuals, etc. This simply did not exist in the 19th century and even during the most part of the 20th century. So in a way, we cannot find precise examples or examples that fit 100%. In our current definition of human rights, but every time has its own semantic. I mean, as a German historian, Reinhard Koselleck always reminded us, he always reminded us you have to take into account that concepts change over time, and our current meaning of those concepts doesn't always correspond to the past meaning of these concepts. So there's an analytical use of concepts and there is a historical use of concepts. So we can look for precedents, but must also be aware of the fact that many people, many characters could serve as examples in the past, nowadays would be considered or would not be considered to be democrats in the full sense of the word. I mean, Marat, Robespierre, even Jean Monnet in some respects.
Yeah, so in other words, well, we do somehow have to square the fact that, well, yes, if I understand you right, yeah, the ancient Greece is in some ways an example to follow, but at the same time, at the times of ancient Greece, democracy would not be seen as an ideal, right? According to Plato. Is this what you're saying? Is that why, well, the current use of concept is
what we want to build is not a democracy following the example 100% of ancient Greece. But obviously, some elements were already there. I mean, the idea of the agora, the idea of public conversation, the idea of representation, much in the same way that parliaments are born in the Middle Ages, in the low Middle Ages, with the argument where if we pay taxes, we need representations, not taxes without representation, which was a typical slogan of the American Revolution. We have to interpret all these tenets, all these slogans properly within their own context. Today, obviously, if you do politics of memory, we have to be aware of these limits, but you also have to be, in a way, pragmatic in order to give these characters and these principles a current meaning.
And maybe to wrap up the conversation, because we are running out of time, when we talked earlier, you had a very interesting thought. The fact that Europe can't really agree on the common memory might not be the bug, it might be the feature. Would you care to repeat it and to kind of express it to the listeners?
Well, it was the conclusion at which a conference in Strasbourg 20 years ago arrived. I mean, there was a conference and many scholars from different fields in Strasbourg. It was 2004 on the eve of the Eastern Enlargement, or enlargement to the East. I mean, the idea was, okay, what are the common features of European identity? And one of the conclusions, which was, if you want quite a pragmatic or even quite a cynic one, it was, well, actually, we're Europeans because we cannot agree on what defines us as Europeans, right? I don't know whether this is a strong element, a strong feature to build an identity upon it. But certainly strong values, democracy, rejection, for instance, of the death penalty, inclusive democracy. I mean, the idea that no matter where you come from, what is your skin color, the language you speak, your religion, your beliefs, I mean, you have to adapt yourself to the basic norms of coexistence within a democratic society. A kind of European constitutional patriotism could be, perhaps, in the sense which was given to the term by some of its coiners, like Jürgen Habermas, the idea of a permanent vigilance, of a permanent care of the values we are defending. I mean, not a letter of a written constitution, of the Maastricht Agreement, whatever. No, the values that are embedded in the foundation of the European Union. This is the legacy the founding fathers gave us, and this is the legacy we have to protect, but we have to constantly update this legacy.
I think that's quite a positive note on which to end the podcast. Professor Seixas, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
So what did you folks think about the discussion?
Oh, well, what brought my attention after the talk with Xosé was his idea that we have to step away from the idea of memory to build our European identity. And in the private talk, he also proposed to look at the symbols as an alternative. And I do agree with him that symbols can be a great concentration of a memory and can represent a certain memory. But my concern is there a possibility that a symbol becomes too shallow and commercialized or commodified, and European identity is being reduced to a certain aesthetical thing and loses its depth.
Do you feel that around you, that this is something that might be happening already?
Yes, definitely. I feel that some young Europeans that are really passionate about the European idea are confusing Europe with tote bags with European flags on it.
Well, if I can jump in, I find that consideration quite interesting because when I first heard the interview with Professor Seixas, what came to my mind was that his approach to values was actually quite intangible and maybe quite challenging to grasp towards the commoner. But again, your concern on the strictly materialistic dimension can be equally problematic. So what I was thinking is if we build the European project strictly around these values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, that this might might be slightly too demanding to sell to the common citizen. And if we sometimes criticize the European project for being slightly too elitist-driven, maybe the tangible things of everyday life would also be of use. This is just a consideration that came to mind.
So what would be some of the tangible things of life?
This again, for instance, I feel like the European flag is something quite powerful that we see when young people are on the streets. And now we can see, for instance, in Serbia or in other countries when people want to have some sort of like proximity to the European project. So I do think that these things matter, even though we need to look at them in a nuanced manner, as you were saying.
Yeah, I also find it interesting that the kind of cases of European flag being really powerful and really salient in the borderlands of Europe, meaning in usually the countries that aren't in Europe yet. For example, like the amount of EU flags in Ukraine or Serbia is very striking. And I feel like it kind of leads to this interesting observation that, well, kind of the European identity is strongest at the borderlands of Europe at this time, which is something that's quite paradoxical, actually.
How do you think is it problematic if our federalism at some point will become European nationalism and we will just drive away from nation states to European nations, ginormous super state?
Yes, and if I can also contribute to that regard, sometimes we look at texts, for instance, I'm thinking of Milan Kundera, and I mean, we do have a Czech person on the table, when he wrote his essay on the tragedy of Central Europe. Basically, what some of the critics say nowadays is that he just moved the border of otherness a bit more towards the east. But deep down, if we really say that the European project is about democracy and pluralism and human rights, then this could have like some sort of universal dimension. Now we see that Canada was actually discussing in the public sphere in a survey, would we consider joining the European Union? So is the project really about a geographical Europe? Is it about the values? And how can we somehow trying to balance this in order not to have an imperial dimension to this, which could be very problematic, right?
So interesting thing with Kundera and what you said with him kind of pushing the boundary of otherness, of like what's the non-us against which we define ourselves against. I think you're right that he tried pushing it more to the east. The big question that I kind of see coming from that is, well, can you have a European identity without the sense of the other? Or do you always need something other against which to kind of, like rally around?
Well, I think there are two ways if you look conceptually on how federations come to be. So, for instance, if you look at the US, you have states that in the face of like external pressure, they decided to come together, to have some sort of like more common defense capabilities and like to better cooperate. And then if you look at states like Germany, a federal state, it was exactly the opposite. How can we decentralize from what it was, create these regions where there's also like power to them instead of having such a strong center to it? So I do understand your question, like, do we need to always build the European project in some sense of comparison to the other? Like, for instance, now more than ever, we have this narrative of a geopolitical commission. Is the European project going to be built in the next decades based on the separation of the other? I don't know. This is an interesting reflection for sure.
Yeah, that's a good case of the United States, because that's where the other was kind of essential, right? And in Germany as well, it was kind of the Bismarck's fabricated war, that kind of, the creation of the French other and the need of this French other to kind of actually create unified Germany. So yeah, the sense of other is definitely looming large in that kind of discussion. Any other points that's kind of the discussion yesterday?
I want to talk about the symbols, most of it. When we talk about Europe, we tend to think about treaties, institutions, or policies. But in reality, one of the most subtle form of unity is built through symbols. Take, for example, the flag of the European Union. The 12 stars do not represent the member states, but rather the idea of unity and perfection. It is a symbol that does not reflect the political reality, but aspires to an idea, a coherent, stable, and united Europe. We also have the euro currency. Not all the member states use it, but what's interesting is that the design of these banknotes, it has bridges and windows, and they are not real monuments, but imaginary ones. That says a lot about Europe, because it doesn't base its unity on a perfect shared past, but on idea of connection. Also, the most emotional symbol in the European anthem, based on Ode to Joy by Ludwig van Beethoven. It has no lyrics, yet it is recognized across all member states. So it is an example of cultural memory transformed into a political symbol.
And if I can add as well, nowadays I saw that there was this discussion on changing the design of the euro bills.
Yeah.
And apparently one of the ideas that I believe won was one that would encompass birds and the design of different bird species, which I think it's incredibly poetic considering that birds also migrate and know no borders. So it's a perfect metaphor, I would say.
It's an interesting perspective, yeah.
It's also a great bridge to considering ecology and nature as a memory of Europeans. Well, we all have a shared memory of going to the forest or living next to the nature, and the landscape of Europe is kind of similar from country to country. So I think if we think about a common European memory, we can consider nature and our relationship to nature as one of that.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic, but I think our strength is in the doubt, in not being able to decide where our memory begins or our identity as Europeans begins or ends. Our constant re-evaluation of ourselves, I think this is what makes us Europeans.
Well, that is a beautiful way to put it. And also building upon what we were discussing outside, I think now that Europe is becoming ever more cosmopolitan and even embracing people from other cultures that originally were not European, we do need to have some sort of flexibility if we want to make a pluralistic identity and encompass for everyone, making sure that everyone feels Europe as their home.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Cheers.
Talking Memories is a production of the School in European Memories. Produced by Fernanda Zanuzzi, Moritz Hergl, and Natalia Papageorgiou. Original idea by Fernanda Zanuzzi and Shesk Meinzer. Recording and post-production, Benjamin Samama. All episodes were recorded at the Jean Monnet House from May 4th to 6th, 2016, during the 4th School on European Memories. This podcast was made possible with the support of the European Commission and the European Parliament. However, the views expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the institutions.